Okay, let's begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this virtual policy forum by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Andrew Tabler, a senior fellow, the Martin J. Gross Fellow in the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute. I recently left the Special Envoy's office in the US Department of State, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce this very esteemed panel to discuss and mark the solemn occasion of the anniversary of the Syrian uprising and to talk about decision-making and the road ahead. 10 years after the Assad regime's arrest and torture of children in Deraa sparked nationwide protests that morphed into civil war, foreign military intervention, and de facto partition, the United States and its allies continue to pursue a sustainable and just settlement for the Syrian people. What lessons do the decade-long conflict and the 21st century's largest humanitarian tragedy hold for the Biden administration? To discuss this, I'm very pleased to join a number of friends to this virtual policy forum. First, Robert S. Ford, who served as ambassador to Syria from the start of the uprising in 2011 until 2014. Robert is currently a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and the Kissinger Senior Fellow at the Yale Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Welcome, Ambassador Ford. Ambassador James Jeffrey, served as US Special Representative for Syria engagement and Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS until November 2020. Previously, he served as Deputy National Security Advisor, US Ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, among other posts. He currently chairs the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Welcome. And last, but certainly not least, Bassma Kodmani, a long-term member of the opposition, is a member of the Syrian Constitutional Committee and Drafting Committee, and a founder of the Syrian National Council, the country's first opposition coalition. She's an author and editor of numerous books and articles on Middle East conflicts, and she holds a doctorate from Sciences Po in Paris. Welcome to all of you. Before we begin, I would just like to take a moment of silence to mark all of those who have perished, suffered, and continue to suffer in the 10-year Syrian civil war. Thank you. All right, so today we're going to be discussing the past, the present, and the future of Syrian policy based on a decade of lessons in decision-making. We'll then turn to question and answer. Either you can put that in the Q&A in the Zoom chat, sorry, in the Zoom box below under Q&A, or you can send an email to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. And I'll go over those again prior to the Q&A session. Okay, first and foremost, with the turn of administrations and looking back here on 10 years of conflict, it's a time to reflect, a time to try and bring about some lessons learned from the conflict. Bassma, I think it's appropriate to start with you. Looking back on the conflict, and you and I met a number of times throughout these 10 years, and you have met with countless representatives of various governments, including those that are on screen here today. What are your impressions from the last decade and some lessons learned?
First of all, thank you. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. Indeed, we've had since 2011, first with Robert Ford, then with Jim Jeffrey, and with you, Andrew, all along discussions in your different capacities. I want to say the following. First of all, what Syrians are living inside Syria today. continued repression, continued fear, continued arrests of not activists, but even humanitarian workers, and a really, really dire situation, disastrous situation on the humanitarian level. We are on the edge of a real hunger crisis. And that I don't think is fully measured, but it has become, for Syrians, their one and only concern. And if we want to say this is what Assad has always hoped would happen, well, he is right. It is happening. They worry about their bread, literally bread, not meat, not anything else, bread, which they cannot secure. So we may see a hunger crisis, a situation of famine growing in Syria if no serious and significant changes in the way aid is distributed occurs. The second is the loss of hope in the diplomatic political course, with one hanging hope. Here's a new administration, maybe we can still expect something, but nothing is coming for now. There is hope that in the efforts on fighting or countering impunity, those trials happening in Germany in particular, possibly in France, only to say that maybe this will have an impact, will create so much embarrassment for Russia and Assad's allies and those countries that are hesitating whether to renew channels, open channels with him or not, to really stop that. But there is also a big questioning of, there are sanctions. We don't know how much these sanctions are responsible for the suffering. Of course, there is a very, very powerful propaganda machine by the regime to say this is the fault of the West, of the Caesar Act, of the Europeans. They're totally indifferent to the suffering of Syrians and so on. But people are saying, okay, if sanctions are one tool to deny Assad victory and return to normal, then what is next? What is next? And the big question is it possible that the United States will only want to be an obstructor of Russian policy, only denying Russia a victory, normalization, return to normal, rehabilitation of Assad? Only obstructing that, only preventing that, that is not what we are used to see from the United States. This used to be the Soviet and then the Russian approach to many crises in the world, but not the United States, because everyone, whether they resent or like the United States, do expect that there are some ideas, clearly defined policy, diplomacy, plans. People refer to Dayton. Dayton was far from ideal, but the United States brokered these arrangements. They brokered Camp David. They can do these things, but they can't just say Russia is in a quagmire. Let it just drown in this quagmire. And I think where we need to really look at over the years, this investment by the United States and Western countries has been too little, too late, always. At no point was it decisive enough, strong enough to change the course and the dynamics on the ground. Will it be the same this time? Are we in the same kind of context? How much investment does it require from the United States? I guess we'll come to that in the discussion a bit later, but I would very much like to hear from your guests also, and come back to that because we have expectations.
Sure, thank you, Bassma. Now, just to keep us in this part of the conversation. You're very much in the sort of where I envisioned us to be towards the end of it. But looking back on the 10 years, what would you say would be, as a senior member of the Syrian opposition, what are the major lessons that you took away from the last 10 years of conflict and dealing with it?
That we still have a big question mark about. We were not given a choice by Assad, and I think this is a very important point. Assad never, over the last 10 years, ever made concessions because he remained with this state of mind that any concession means weakness and any concession is dangerous for him. He is not going to get anything in return. He's just going to be on a slippery slope. And this will be that his weakness will emerge, will appear. And this is, you know, people say this is the lesson he learned from his father, be tough, and you haven't been tough enough. And so the obsession that concession means weakness. And with this approach, we have had no concession ever all along those years. And here, I think, is where Syrians would have liked to see, if there had been any flexibility, then we would have had, as opposition, I speak about us as opposition, for having worked with all the different groups and factions, we would have asked ourselves, where is Syrian society, mainstream Syrian society? Where does it want to be? What are the options that it really wants? Is it what our colleagues from the Islamist movement are advocating? Is it more the liberal? Is it what the leftists are saying? Is it who exactly represents something that would bring Syrians back together? The polarization was something that Assad encouraged. We fell into that, and I would say it is a good time now to look back and assess and maybe revise our approach. But we do need the diplomatic space. We need countries to tell us there is space to start talking about that and discussing that. For the moment, there is no signal from anywhere.
Wise words, Bassma. Thank you very much for that. Ambassador Ford, you and I spoke from even before the conflict often, and Robert was kind enough to join me from Damascus via Skype for the launch of my book at the time to discuss Syria policy. And we had a number of conversations along the way, and I know you've been writing and dealing with it ever since. Looking back on this 10 years later, what are the lessons you carry away from it? What did we do wrong? What did we do right? And then I'll turn to Ambassador Jeffrey. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to see Jim, with whom I served overseas, and to see Bassma again, whom I met many times over the years. And so I'll just say a couple of things looking back to my time at the start of the revolution. And I appreciate, Andrew, that you had a moment of silence, because I think that was entirely appropriate. The scale of the human tragedy is unimaginable. That said, I think we in the American administration, the Obama administration, made two really fundamental mistakes at the start. The first is we did not understand in 2012 and 2013 that the Syrian conflict really was a war, and that military issues and military balances on the ground would be the most important thing. We repeated over and over, and with great sincerity, I have to say, it wasn't an act. We genuinely believed there could be no military solution to the Syrian conflict. We really believed that. But I don't think we understood, as we said that, how the Assad government perceived victory. That is to say, his staying in power was victory. And so when we would say there's no military solution to the conflict, we were overlooking what Assad was trying to achieve. And I think that was a bad mistake. It affected our policy in all kinds of ways. Sanctions, I remember, Andrew, you and I talked about imposing sanctions on the Syrian oil sector back in 2012. And we actually got them imposed, thinking again that the economic pain would compel Assad to negotiate. But we weren't thinking really that it's a war and the military would be the predominant issue. So a related mistake we made, and I will be very interested to hear what Jim has to say about this, is I think in the period between 2012 and 2014 particularly, when I was there, at least I can speak to, we depended far too much on Moscow and on the Russians. We constantly thought the Russians could deliver significant political compromises from the Assad government. And I don't think we ever understood, as well as we should have, that Moscow was not interested in compelling Assad to make significant political reforms. It's one thing to say you don't like Assad, and they said that repeatedly, but it's a different thing to say we will therefore require him or pressure him to make concessions. And I vividly remember, and I'm sure Bassma does too, in the Geneva I negotiations in Lausanne and then in Geneva in January and February of 2014, the Syrian opposition delegation in writing gave to Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN mediator, a proposal to set up a transition national government in line with the Geneva I communique, a transitional national government with full executive authority, and they said they were willing to negotiate even the position of Bashar al-Assad. They did not make it a prerequisite that he step aside. They said they were even willing to negotiate that. Frankly, the Americans were surprised by that. It was not something we were expecting. We thought, oh, this will really help the negotiations. It's good. And I can tell you that Lakhdar Brahimi was shocked to get such a document with such flexibility. But no surprise, the Syrian government refused not only to negotiate it, they wouldn't even pick the piece of paper up when Lakhdar Brahimi put it in front of them at the table. And when we went, Wendy Sherman and I, to talk to the Russians to say, you got to get the Assad government to the table, that's the whole point of us all being here in Switzerland right now. The Russians just said, "Niet, no." I remember it very well, and Wendy was quite tough in that meeting, and the Russians would not budge. They would not budge. They were not interested in pressuring Assad to negotiate. That was in February 2014. That was the end of the Geneva I talks at the time. So I think this dependence on Russia has been a hope, not an analysis. I want to finish with some questions that I have taken out of this period. And I don't have an answer to the questions, but I do think historians and serious people who study this time period with the Syrian conflict need to think about them. Number one, in 2013, we had thought about a no-fly zone over all of Syria. Remember, the Russian Air Force was not deployed in Syria at the time. But none of us, myself included, advocated strongly for a no-fly zone. In fact, frankly, nobody was pushing for it. Not the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not the Secretary of Defense, OSD, and not the State Department, as I said, myself included. We were very leery of getting into a military operation of indefinite duration. We thought it would be too expensive. I remember that we were briefed that it would take thousands of airplane sorties and hundreds of aircraft. None of us, remember, we're just getting out of Iraq. None of us wanted to go into this. Now, as I look back, since 2015, we've had a no-fly zone east of the Euphrates River with far fewer costs. And I think maybe we should have rethought that at the time. That's a question. It's an open question. I don't have an answer for it. Second open question I have. I'm still shocked when I think back of the discussions in 2013, when already we were having problems with getting humanitarian assistance into Syria, especially up in the north, that we were blocked, those of us that advocated getting aid in through Turkey, by lawyers in the Obama administration who said that is a violation of Syrian sovereignty and it is against international law. And we said, people are dying. I mean, I understand about respecting international law and sovereignty, but people are literally dying because of this hesitancy. And the Obama administration was hung up on this for months and months. And it was only when finally in the UN Security Council in late 2013, they got the resolution passed that they could do the cross-border aid. Prior to that, the Americans were totally hung up. And I think there needs to be a discussion about the limits of international sovereignty when it impedes the development of humanitarian assistance. And remember that in turn helped destabilize the region. I mean, not surprisingly, the number of refugees flowing into Turkey increased. Who would blame the Syrian refugees? Stay in Syria and starve? It's not a reasonable choice. So that whole question of international law and the limits on state sovereignty, I think is still very open. And Syria is a textbook case. Finally, this is a question which I think we'll never get a clear answer to, but it needs to be discussed. We had always assumed in the Obama administration during my time there, that if you put enough pressure on Bashar al-Assad and his clique, they would finally negotiate. And very thoughtful analysts have disagreed with that over the last years. People like Josh Landis, people like Aaron Lund. And I certainly respect their knowledge and their understanding of Syria. And so this is an open question. But again, much of American policy, frankly, all of American policy in 2012 and 13 was based on the idea that Assad eventually, with enough pressure, would negotiate. And I have to say that in retrospect is not so clear to me. I would never claim to be an expert on Syria. Andrew, thank you very much for this invitation. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, thank you very much for that, Robert. Yeah, it's a real trip down memory lane there. Ambassador Jeffrey, you were following Syria. You spent a lot of time in the US government, including in Iraq with Robert, and then eventually took over the Syria portfolio under President Trump. As somebody who was watching this from not too far away, but from outside, looking back on this, what do you see? And how did it affect what you, how it affect you approached the job that you would take over? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be back at my long-term home, the Washington Institute, with all of you. It's a pleasure to be with both Andrew and Robert, who I've served with repeatedly, and with you, Bassma, who is a soulmate of ours in the struggle for a decent future for Syria. Let me start with my criticism of what I think was a fairly consistent policy, and this will sound very similar to what Robert just said, not just during the Obama, but during the first 2 years of the Trump administration towards Syria. Historians will look back and see the Syrian conflict as a transitional point between the conflicts we grew used to after 1989, the Afghanistans, or more successfully, the Bosnias, and the conflicts we see now, the sharp state-state conflict just a few months ago in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia, supported by outside powers, or what we see in the Taiwan Straits. That's an important point. We had not just a failure of American policy, and Robert touched on several of the points, but we also had a problem of imagination. Neither administration could really get its mind around the fact that this was something more than just Somalia on steroids, that it was a state-state conflict, and that the geostrategic fundamental pillars of Middle East security, such as it's been for the last 40 years, were in play. The result was flowing from that two things. First of all, we continued to think, despite much evidence to the contrary, that if we huffed and puffed and tried really hard with our European friends and NGOs and such, we could really remove leaders, change the internal constitution in the small c word of a state, and make it all better. We couldn't in Syria, frankly, we haven't in many other places. The second thing that flowed from this was a tendency to look at each of the horrific results of the Syrian conflict, the refugee flows that destabilized European countries, the terrorist wave, particularly with ISIS, but not only, Turkey's concern about a PKK statelet on itself, Israel's concern about Iranian missile systems, the chemical weapons sphere, the terrific mass, as Robert said, human rights violations and war crimes. All of these things focused bits and pieces of various bureaucracies, American and international, on fixing or managing that specific problem, rather than the underlying issue. This changed specifically in September of 2018, when, after violating 4 of the 5 ceasefire zones, 4 between Turkey and Russia under the Astana process, and 1, the Da Nang agreement between us and the Russians, in Syria, where Assad marched in, the 5th and last in Idlib in the northwest, we faced a decision in the Trump administration. The chemical weapons people were concerned. They thought that Assad would use chemical weapons. Perhaps we'd have to respond militarily. The terrorism people were worried about all of these terrorists who were still in Idlib being spread all over the world. The refugee people saw the 3.5 million IDPs as yet another wave to destabilize Turkey and on into Europe. What we tried to do is to also see, and this was mainly Mike Pompeo persuading the president, that this was a geostrategic change. Robert is absolutely right on Assad's definition of victory. But right now, at this point, people had gotten more ambitious on the other side by 2018. This was looking like a total military victory and a reconquista of the entire country. So the Trump administration took the position not one step further forward, and it has maintained that up until the January change of administrations, and for geostrategic reasons. We switched positions and we adopted, if you will, and Bassma has criticized it and she is right, a low-risk response. Similar to what we took against the Soviets in Afghanistan as part of our, frankly, overarching Cold War strategy, similar to what we took with the Iranians in southern Iraq from 1980, roughly 82 to 1988. We weren't going to commit the diplomatic and particularly military resources to fix the underlying problem. We were going to prevent the other side from achieving a victory and hoping that somehow, some way, that would produce an eventual compromise or a withdrawal, as it did in the Cold War, as it did in Afghanistan and Iraq. I cannot promise and never promised it would in Syria because of the reasons that Robert said. We all knew that neither Russia nor Assad were very interested in some kind of compromise. What we were trying to say is, okay, then you will live with this quagmire. Your ability to leverage Syria to advance the Iranian hegemonic design for the region, or Russia's effort to overthrow or replace or challenge the American security system, is going to be stymied. And we'll wait until you can perhaps make another judgment of the risks inherent in what you're doing. To do this, we hammered together, and Robert is right, DOD was not interested, But we looked at all the resources, and between the Israelis in the air, us in the northeast and in the south at Al-Tanf, our on-order chemical weapons retaliation, the Turks' presence in the northwest, the remaining Syrian opposition fighters, we felt we had the functional equivalent of, as Robert put it, a no-fly zone, no-drive zone set of things. It was wacky. It involved a lot of people who didn't like each other, beginning with the Turks and the Israelis, but it helped to freeze the conflict. It has been frozen on the ground militarily with minor changes since that moment in September 2018. Secondly, continuing to up the pressure through the Caesar Act, European sanctions, diplomatic pressure from the Arab League, blocking countries from trying to embrace Assad, blocking countries from trying to give him reconstruction assistance. That has worked well. And then a diplomatic track. Again, we were not ambitious. We wanted to have a comprehensive solution. We believe that would be the best for everyone, beginning with the Syrian people. But if necessary, we would continue with a stalemate, because a solution, a success that would leave Assad in charge, Russia and Iran empowered in the Middle East, was more dangerous to our overall and our partners and allies in the region's overall interests than continuing this messy situation, which, as I said, is a military stalemate now. I'll stop here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. Ambassador Ford, maybe we just very quickly go back to you. You've written a number of pieces outlining, including one in Foreign Affairs, U.S. strategy in Syria has failed, which oftentimes I think is a very interesting piece. And of course, we all know we don't pick our titles when we write for external publications. Can you, based on what Ambassador Jeffrey just discussed, can you critique that a little bit and tell us a little bit about where do you think the Trump administration's policy went wrong?
First, I would be at the top of the list to acknowledge that the Trump administration inherited a failed policy from the Obama administration. So they came in with opportunities missed and windows shut that they could not reopen. So I would not blame the Trump administration solely for the failure of American efforts in Syria. The conflict is dynamic. And what was true in 2012 or 2013, 2014 was not necessarily true in 2017, 18, 19, or 20. So I would just leave it at this. The conflict has evolved in ways militarily that it's at this point impossible for the Americans to reverse without a significantly greater military escalation on our part and part of allies. And I don't think there's any public support for that in the United States. I mean, it's one thing to send in a few Bradley armored vehicles, but a few Bradley armored vehicles are not, or a surface-to-air defense system is not going to change the military balance. That's why I led off with my remark about the military balance, because it's a war. It really is a war. And sanctions aren't going to fix that problem. If I thought that the Bashar al-Assad government cared a whit about the welfare of its own people, I would think sanctions might lead to something, but they won't. And I have huge sympathy with the goals of the Caesar sanctions, but I don't know that it's going to be able to split the regime the way that people hope from the Caesar sanctions. It seems to me they're still hanging pretty tough altogether. And I think we should understand why. They understand, wouldn't ever compare them to the American Revolutionary generation except in this. Ben Franklin said we either hang together or we hang separately. And I think the Assad clique understands that pretty well. And they have 4 secret police services to enforce it for those who don't understand it. So I don't think America can now fix Syria. With all due respect to those who have lost their lives fighting in this revolution, it's just not something the Americans in 2021 can fix. And I think, therefore, we need to like step back a little bit, look at what our really essential national security interests are in Syria, the really essential ones for American national security, and that is that ISIS and related extremists not be able to threaten us from Syria. That's the core American interest at this point. What we had hoped to do in 2012 or 2013, 2014, opportunities are gone. And when we look at that core interest, suddenly the American deployment in eastern Syria does not strike me as being absolutely essential. There may be other ways to do it at less cost. I do think America has a moral obligation, and you might be able to make a national security argument as well for helping refugee communities in places like Lebanon, especially Lebanon, but also Jordan, Turkey, and of course, the displaced populations in Idlib province, where the Russians are about to shut down the cross-border operation. That, I think, would be a much more logical focus for the Americans in the next year and two, 2021 and 2022, and not hoping that we're going to extract from an unrepentant and undefeated Assad government significant political reform.
Okay, just with an observation of time there, maybe we should go into, since Bassma already discussed a little bit about in their earlier comments about US policy, let's go into the road ahead. I know all of you care about that, certainly I do. Jim, what do we know about the Biden administration's Syria policy? Just for disclosure, the White House respectively declined to send us a representative to today's policy forum to discuss their approach. A new special envoy at a senior level has not been named, at least one at the same level as many of our, let's say, European allies, although there is an interim. And some key people have been released from the Syria team since the turn of administrations. A policy review is widely rumored to be soon underway. I think it's appropriate to start with Ambassador Jeffrey on this, since you designed the last policy and implemented it along with myself and a whole team of others. If you were in the PCC or DC meeting on this policy review, what would you say?
For the moment, not very much, because as you said, and as we've all independently checked, they do not yet have a Syria policy. It has not been blessed. Here's the problem. Their inclinations, at least at the middle-high working levels, are actually to do exactly what Robert said, to focus on the defeat of ISIS, because everybody gets that terrorism is a threat to us, and everybody cares about humanitarian concerns, and they're really pressing in Syria. Those are also, let's face it, two things we can do. We haven't been able to get the 12 million refugees and IDPs back, but we have done a tolerably good job at the cost of, just for us and the Europeans, $3 or $4 billion a year of keeping them more or less fed, keeping them in their areas. And we've done a pretty good job containing ISIS in Iraq and northeast Syria. We haven't in the rest of Syria. The Assad regime is under control there, and it is not good at fighting ISIS. That gets to the problem with this. And I'll come back to that very quickly. The conflict with the administration is it just put out Wednesday evening a interim national security strategic guidance, which looks a lot like what administrations usually get out after about a year, a national security strategy. It stresses, among other things, just like the Trump administration did, near peer competition with very explicit language that Russia is trying to overthrow the security system globally that we put together. It doesn't point that out in the Middle East. Rather, it talks about Iran doing its version of that in the region, specifically threatening states in this as people know, long-term Iranian effort to expand not just influence but power throughout the Arab world. And it highlights the importance of dealing with our allies and partners in the region with their security concerns, fighting off ISIS, and ending conflicts. This argues for a broader approach to Syria than simply dealing with ISIS and dealing with the refugee situation, because as I said, both are manifestations of the underlying conflict. And if they let the underlying conflict, if they ignore it, what will happen is the glue that holds together this very complicated set of military, economic, and diplomatic pressure will dry up and crack. Assad, Iran, and Russia will seize control of the entire country, will proclaim a victory. People will embrace Assad for one or another reason. He will get the Iranians out. No, he won't. He can be our ally against ISIS. Good luck with that. But those are the arguments that will be made, and we will be facing a different Middle East. That's my concern. But again, the administration at some level recognizes the conflict, the contradiction between its overall strategy and its interim basis, but it's probably the one it will stick with, and the non-application of that strategy to Syria, which is the biggest battleground for Iran in the Middle East and the biggest battleground for Russia in the Middle East. That's the geostrategic problem we have now, and now it owns it. That is, it is the Biden administration.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. So actually at this point, it might be very useful before I turn to Robert and Bassma, to Corey, if you could put up our first map for the viewers. This is the map of Syria as we originally envisioned it, the political map of Syria, and the one that we used early on in the conflict to define it in many ways. I think what was particularly interesting over time, the evolution. One thing that by working in the US government over the last few years was our understanding that actually the situation had become far more complicated. And my sometimes colleague at the Washington Institute, Fabrice Belange, has made recently another book, another map. Corey, if you could put that up, please. That outlines the complexity of the current situation in the fact of we called it in government 5 armies. Some people called it a damn mess. In any case, the sovereignty of the Syrian state had been completely diminished, and the sphere of influence model that had evolved over the course of the war now reigns supreme. And for better or for worse, either through Turkish intervention or COVID, or maybe both, we at least for some time have had the national ceasefire that we had been pursuing, although under completely different circumstances and far more perhaps tragic ones. Robert, if you were in the room, and Bassma, I want you to chime in on this as well, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Under a Syria policy review, what would you say at this point, given what Ambassador Jeffrey has laid out and given where we are at the moment?
I very much want to hear from Bassma, so I'll be very short. What I would say is Russia has long been predominant in Syria. They were when I was there as ambassador, and they were 40 years before that. And it doesn't really change the military balance if they expand the number of advisors or if they have an air base or something. The Israelis are still very superior in terms of the military balance. I would say that's a long-term success of the Americans, is to get Israel to that point of regional military security. And they're using it to trim the grass, to mow the grass, with respect to the Iranians trying to infiltrate missile systems in. They have that capability and they're using it. So I think it's just important for the Americans to be realistic about what they can and cannot achieve. And there's just a lot in Syria that we can't fix anymore. You know, I teach at Yale, and Robert McNamara, looking back on Vietnam in his book in Retrospect, published in 1995, said, we need to understand there are some problems the Americans overseas just cannot fix. Syria is obviously not Vietnam, but I think the lesson still applies in some ways.
Bassma, over to you. What do you think about what Ambassador Jeffrey and Ambassador Ford just laid out? What can the U.S. do at this point to perhaps not fix the Syrian conflict, but to bring about an outcome that is acceptable for the Syrian people after all this suffering?
First of all, I do want to say the conflict under the Trump administration, I beg to differ with Jim Jeffrey, was not frozen. We have a second conflict that is very dangerous for the future of a country like Syria. I am a Syrian and I want a united Syria. It may not matter to others. To me, it matters. When Arabs and Kurds are confronting each other, and when Turkey is given a free hand to conduct massive bombing, displacement, and changes on the ground, pitting Arabs against Kurds, that for me is civil war. That is introducing civil war, encouraging it. And you probably know, not probably, I think you all know, the efforts that part of the opposition has tried to conduct to come to terms with, to agreements with the Kurdish opposition and the autonomous administration in those areas, and what we can agree on in order not to confront each other and in order to bring this strategic card on the side of the opposition. We did not get the help we needed. And I think here we really need a role for the United States, not to be just a facilitator of intra-Kurdish talks, but to be a guarantor, to guarantee vis-a-vis Turkey that the opposition and the Kurds need to reach an agreement, of course, with all the needed concessions and changes that need to happen for that, not to worry Turkey and not to represent a threat for its national security. We are aware of that. No agreement is viable if it threatens Turkey. We know that. But then, nevertheless, we need to have that veto lifted so that we can talk and so that we can reach agreements. You may have heard of the idea that some Syrians are now floating about a military council because they see that there is absolutely nothing in prospect for a political process. What is a military council? It's very concrete in what it is offering. It draws the lessons that nobody cares so much about democracy for Syria anymore, but everybody cares about this place not being a source of insecurity for the world and for the region. And therefore, a military council may be your best partner in this area. I won't go into that. This is just the beginning of a process, but I think Syrians are trying to think very concretely of what needs to happen. What would happen? Naturally, such a military council would reach an agreement with the SDF. And so here is where the role of the United States is important. Robert Ford said war is over in Syria. Okay, if war is over, which is what we hope, then a policy, an American policy, does not need to invest highly in Syria. No high investment is required. It can still be a low risk, low cost policy of saying what didn't work under Obama may work today, because after all, Russia, and we know Russia is the power, the country that will count and will decide. We know that, and you yourselves know that we talk to the Russians because we think they are the ones who are really have enough interest in maybe helping Syrians reach something to get out of this. No ideal solution. Assad is not going to go away tomorrow, but maybe we can gradually reach some arrangement that brings this country back together. But there are two issues there: the Kurdish issue and the risk of having a long-term confrontation between Arabs and Kurds that is not easily repairable. And secondly, of course, Iran on Syrian territory. That Israel every other day bombs Iranian installations in Syria. This is while we wait for something to happen of a more stable nature. But if we agree that Russia is seeking to overthrow the security system of the United States and the West, globally, including in the Middle East, then there is no consistency in pulling out of Syria and saying we don't have any vital interests there. We can leave it to the Russians and they can deal with it. So I have a problem with the way these issues have been defined, because it is a recipe for absolute continued warfare, violence, insecurity, and the manufacturing of new jihadis out of this country. So coming back to a multilateral framework, which we have not seen enough in the last few years in the United States, the Europeans have been very committed to sanctions, and sanctions are frankly very legitimate because they are against individuals mainly. If we are very careful to make them a bit smarter, fine. But it is about committing not to go for reconstruction. And I think this is where it's very painful for the Syrians to know that they are being denied those funds, and yet we know that there is no other policy that anyone is willing to use to deny Assad his full military victory by now funding him. So we don't want those funds to reach. We are fighting to get alternative channels for aid to reach Syrians, not for Syrians to be denied aid, but not to give the money to Assad only. And that should be negotiated today. This is very practical. Negotiate those other channels. Yes, the cross-border, but we can't live with the Russian veto again and say, okay, there's a Russian veto. Now we've crossed the last cross-border and there are no other channels. Yes, there are other channels. Some are working in a very clandestine, underground way. We need to scale those up, and we need to get recognition that we have to do that because Assad does not use the funds properly. There are many issues, very concrete, on the ground that need to happen. And that needs investment, political, a lot of diplomatic, engineering and heavy lifting, but we have lacked enough of that. And there is no quick answer and one answer to Syria. There may be 5 or 6 or 9 different issues that all need to be addressed. And Jim Jeffrey, I think, has pointed to those. These are not just consequences. They are at the heart of the issues. We're not going to deal with Assad now, but we need to deal with all these little, not little, these are minefields, one and the other, and will continue exploding one after the other over the years. So I'll leave it at that, but I am uncomfortable with saying the conflict was frozen, or that now that war is over, we've lost it and this is it. I don't believe the United States can say that in its own interest, not just for moral reasons.
Okay, thank you, Bassma. That was very articulate. Let's move on to questions very briefly, and then we have to adjourn. We have one question here from Diane, and it concerns talking about crimes against humanity. So I'll sort of paraphrase this. 2 weeks ago on 60 Minutes, there was a very long expose regarding the Caesar photos, bringing it front and center to the American public yet again. It was the basis for the Syria, what now is the Caesar law, which was airdropped in the NDAA in 2019. And while on the Syria team with Ambassador Jeffrey, we implemented it as of June 2020, including the designation of 114 Syrian individuals on this. Over to the panel, and I don't know who'd like to answer this first. You know, we haven't talked a lot about crimes against humanity or atrocities so far, mostly because we were talking about the political aspect. How much does the scale of these atrocities in Syria by the Assad regime in particular change the international reaction to this conflict? How does it make it different than a Somalia or another kind of quagmire, so to speak? Perhaps Ambassador Jeffrey, you'd like to start. We can go down the line.
Sure, and in a nutshell, it'll also be my criticism of some of the other comments made. The combination of, once again, the geostrategic stakes in Syria that make it more than Somalia on steroids, and going back to the Somalia on steroids, how absolutely awful this conflict is. The things Assad and his henchmen have done, from the chemical weapons use to the barrel bombings, to driving literally half the population, 12 million people, out of their homes, leaves a huge stain. One of our allies, surprisingly, given where we were with them elsewhere in the Middle East, in our policy towards Syria was the European Union and key European states. They were motivated not only by the waves of terror and the waves of refugees in 2015, but the absolute degradation of their value system, our value system, by this conflict. That's not the key factor. It was one of a set of factors that together put together the policy that we were following, because this generated a lot of interest. It was their top priority. It wasn't Turkey or Israel's top priority. They had other top priorities, but it was all part of the mix.
Robert or Bassma, do the scale of atrocities, Bassma, I probably think I know your answer, but do the scale of atrocities that occurred in Syria and then the Caesar law, I mean, I realize your point about sanctions alone. You and I had a lot of discussions about that along the way. Although, to be fair, my recollection of our discussions and those with your superiors and my outside intervention, I think both of us indicated that the sanctions would be a useful tool, but that in the end, with a minority-dominated clientelistic regime, these things don't go without a kick, or maybe just more precisely, a military intervention. Do the scale of atrocities change this at all? And how would you use the Caesar law to achieve our objectives in this regard? Is there a way to do it? Is there a way to split the regime? I realize you say you're not an expert on the regime, but you've had a lot of time to look at it. Robert, can you hear me?
I thought the question was directed to Bassma. I'm happy to say something. But...
sorry. Okay, well, I'd like to hear from Bassma as well. Bassma, do you want to tackle that first?
I'm happy to leave it to Robert. It's fine.
Okay.
So real quick, because justice is about Syrians more than it is about Americans. So I'm just going to make two very quick points, and then I want to give the floor to Bassma. Number one, obviously there is a need for justice. I mean, that just goes without saying. And the scale of atrocities is such that I cannot imagine that even 30 years from now, if he's still there, and he very well might be, Bashar al-Assad is ever going to be received in Paris again, or anywhere in Europe, Western Europe certainly, large parts of the world. He's going to be like the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, basically a pariah. And I say that word, and as soon as I said it, I thought, uh-oh, the Biden administration just used that word. But I mean, seriously, he will be essentially excluded from everything. I mean, the evidence, as Stephen Rapp said the other night on the 60 Minutes, is just overwhelming, and the scale is overwhelming. So I don't think there's ever going to be normalization the way we understand the word normally with that government, ever. Second, but that doesn't mean he doesn't continue to hold the major population centers of the country. That's different. Second, I think we should also understand that the Caesar sanctions, by targeting scores of individuals in this absolutely abhorrent, brutal, unrepentant regime, is going to make it harder to split them. And if the political strategy is we need to split them to sort of facilitate edging Assad out over time, I think this is working in the opposite direction. But the need for justice remains outstanding. And that's just an awful trade-off, awful. I'm glad I don't have to make it. I think Syrians are the ones that in the end have to decide on this. And so I'm going to shut up and turn it over to Bassma.
Bassma, over to you. And then we're probably going to have to adjourn because we're a little bit over time. Please, the floor is yours.
I'll be very brief and say, I have not been the one most involved in the issue of prosecution and the human rights violations and the atrocities and crimes raising those as files with it has been the work of human rights organizations, but we have gone very far in getting international mechanisms in place for those crimes to be somehow not remain unpunished. So if that can be guaranteed that this continues and is an active track, because as long as also there is nothing on the political side, we're not even with the dilemma of peace without justice or justice without peace. We are in the middle of a no political solution. So we might as well tell Syrians at least that track is active and have it really activated by everyone. The United States has not been the most active on this level, but we do hope to see that more happens on that. That is a way of reassuring Syrians a little bit. And then going to practical arrangements. Just get those arrests to stop, those executions to stop. Not what happened, what is still happening. So when people say, oh, let's normalize with Assad, the question is not, no, should we normalize with Assad while he continues to commit those same crimes? This is the question to the international community. It has to be put in those terms for any country that is tempted to open up to Assad. Yes, he's a pariah. We can live with him being treated as a pariah, but we really cannot live with him going back to normal or shaking any respectable leader's hand.
Very interesting, Bassma. Yeah, I think if I was to just chime in on this, and then I think we're, unfortunately, because we're over time, we're going to have to end. It particularly hit me as someone who's worked on Syria for a long time and then went to work on the NSC before going over to the Syria envoy shop. The degree to which my job, particularly at the White House, dealt with issues that were Syria related, but were part of this multi-layered conflict that had evolved, not only in the strategic 5 armies kind of intervention in Syrian territory, but the implications for crimes against humanity, the Chemical Weapons Convention, nuclear non-proliferation, narco trafficking, which is a huge issue now and emerging issue. As Robert said, it struck me that Syria really had become North Korea on the Mediterranean, which I think went in concert with the evolution of the war from that of an uprising to a civil war to a then regionalized and internationalized conflict, and one that I think continues to this day. We're hoping that the administration brings an incoming team that can address all of the problems that come out of this conflict. We hope that today's discussion has contributed to that, and I know all of you will continue to write. And so I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions. But with that, I will adjourn. Thank you so much, Ambassador Jeffrey, Ambassador Ford, and Bassma. Really great to be together with you. Let's do it again and go into the details. Obviously, the international community and the Syrian people need them, and hopefully we won't be here 10 years from now talking about the same issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you, Andrew.